Hello, I am Brennan Storr, host of the Ghost Story Guys podcast.
And I am Joseph Comeau, host of a lot of things. This, the Cardinal Rule, whatever else I happen to be doing that week.
Yes, and this is Weird Together, where we talk about the latest and greatest in, well, I guess independent horror movies at this point, because we're weird and you're weird. So why not be weird together?
Weird Together is part of the Ghost Story Guys family, which also includes the podcast Mysteries and Monsters, Luke Lore, and Transmissions from the Void.
Yes, Transmissions from the Void is a horror audio podcast. So if you like horror fiction, check it out. We are really proud of that one. And it is now available on streaming platforms everywhere. So Joseph.
Yeah.
It's been a little while.
It has, yeah.
We missed December, did we not?
We did. I don't know if I really missed it, but yeah.
Well, yeah. We won't miss it, but I think we missed the show.
Right. So, we did.
Yes.
But it's good to be back, man.
It really is. Yes. I was just saying to you off air that I this afternoon I went to go see Skinamarink, which is an ultra low budget independent Canadian horror film that is playing in limited release in theaters. And it looks like it's coming out on Shudder on February 2nd. So I think that'll be the first film for our audio version of the show. And I'm desperate to make you watch that. Because I had to watch it.
That seems like a pattern. If I have to watch it, you have to watch it, Joe.
No, you're not wrong. You're not wrong.
And we're still friends, so I don't know what that says, but
nothing. Well, it's something good. I'm sure that either that or both of us have an enormous capacity for abuse.
Yes.
And I should say, I'm not shitting on Skinamarink. It's a very original, it is of a singular vision. It's a challenging film. We'll say that. We'll talk more about that when it comes out, though. But this time around, Joseph, we are talking about Something in the Dirt.
We are.
Yes. That is the latest film from directors Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead, who've previously done films like Synchronic, Resolution, The Endless, and a couple others I'm missing, one of which I quite like, so I'm annoyed that I've forgotten it. But regardless, talented indie filmmakers. And this is their latest effort. It's an ultra DIY film, came out again last year, shot during COVID, very small crew. And it is about two men who witnessed something seemingly paranormal in one of their apartments. And so they set out to document it. And we are going to be talking about it. But before we do that, of course, when you watch a movie, you don't just watch it in a vacuum. You always have baggage. All right, Joseph, what was your baggage going into Something in the Dirt?
So my baggage, in part, was about expectations and also lack of familiarity. I'm sort of new in this genre, and it's part of what's interesting, I think, about what we do is I get to kind of come at it from a new perspective, someone who isn't familiar with these films. So I didn't know about these two filmmakers and their previous work. And when I went into it, it set this sort of tone initially of being this kind of serious, semi-documentary, mockumentary, found footage or something like that type of film. And I expected it to maybe, be something that was trying to be really serious. And as I got through it, and we'll certainly get into this later, I saw that, or I learned afterwards that there were sort of almost some comedic notes and satire notes and things we can talk about. And I think based on my expectations, I didn't watch the film the right way the first time. Upon my second viewing, I think those notes hit differently, and I got it better. So part of my baggage was kind of going into it with expectations of maybe a more serious horror sci-fi film, and it wasn't trying to be that serious in those ways, I think, as after I watched it the second time.
Interesting. Okay. So for me, my baggage going in, again, I was familiar with the filmmakers. I think I've seen all of their films except for Resolution, their first. I have not seen that. But I'm generally speaking in the bag for their stuff. It's really, really inventive, clever sci-fi. Again, The Endless is great. Synchronic is great. I feel like there's one in between those two that I'm just blanking on. It's driving me fucking crazy. But anyways, I was in the bag. My only hesitation going in was that I knew it was a COVID production. And there was another COVID era, not era, we're still in the fucking COVID era, but another COVID horror film called In the Earth, directed by Ben Wheatley, that was shot during kind of lockdown. And I didn't like it. It was popular. I know it did very well, but critically, at least, I don't know how it did financially, but I didn't really enjoy it. You know, I felt like from what I understand, after listening to other podcasts, when the lockdown hit, a lot of people said, okay, this is the time for me to write that great novel or that great screenplay. Right. But then once we came out of it, from what I understand, and again, I'm not in that industry, so I can't say this with any definite certainty, but I've heard this from people in the industry. From what I understand, a lot of those scripts were not great. You know, but I can't imagine why. The world's falling down around your fucking ears. Right. It's weird that you're not on your A game. So again, I wasn't crazy about In the Earth. I kind of thought it was a little bit half-baked, and it just wasn't for me. So I wasn't sure about this one. You know, I knew it was very small, and so I wasn't sure what to expect. But I mean, short version is I very much enjoyed it, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you about it, because there's really only one place we can do that, Joseph.
Yes.
That's a Toctagon.
Welcome to the Toctagon. 2 men enter, 2 men leave.
Yes.
Right.
And we should say, again, this is, we're recording this via video because this is our monthly live stream, but this is going to be available as an audio podcast as well. So if you are listening to this on our feed, we will be on RSS feeds as Weird Together. We're not yet, but we will be shortly. And if you are listening to this, there are going to be little video stings that are not going to make a lot of sense, but I assure you they're very clever, primarily because they were designed by me. And if you don't think they're clever, they were designed by Joseph.
Right. That's completely unfair and par for the course. Yeah.
Yeah, you knew what this was when you signed on.
That's true. Yeah.
So you thought the film was funny, which I didn't expect. I didn't see coming. I did not. But so I'm curious to hear about this.
So, obviously it was not a yuck comedy film, all the way through, but there were these comedic notes, and, I didn't quite catch them my first viewing. Maybe some of them a little bit, but as I got into it, I caught them a lot more. There were some obvious things, just, like the radiation suit, right? Like the absurd, right?
Yeah.
It reminds me of, and I didn't prepare an images, but if you've ever seen the movie, it's the M. Night Shyamalan movie with Mel Gibson and Joaquin Phoenix. Signs, and the point where he walks in and Joaquin Phoenix has the tinfoil hat on. It's just kind of that absurd, ridiculous stuff. Like, yeah, that's really going to protect you from radiation. So there was that. I thought that, like, the points where they interviewed the various specialists and scientists and various people that, they're doing these serious interviews and looking interviews, and certainly one of them, the first one, with this professor who was it art history or something, they said that she did. I will say that first interview with her, when she says it was really sad what happened here and not just for the one who died. Okay, that set a serious tone.
Right.
But throughout the film, as they started interviewing additional specialists and various other folks, there were just these things that were subtle humor where, like, it seemed like that John and Levi had set out to interview these people wanting something, and they were not delivering in what they wanted. They were like, they interviewed the one geologist, and he's like, well, they're asking, well, what did you find there? And he's describing a few of the mineral deposits. Well, what about the quartz and how that generates electricity? He's like, no, that's not going to generate electricity.
Yeah, well, but that's not how that works.
Yeah. But you call him your scientist friend, right? Yes. He's like, yeah, I reached out to a friend from college or whatever, and Professor so-and-so, and because I thought there was maybe some impaired cognitive stuff going on, right? Like, he's like, they're looking for him to say, yeah, there's something under this house that's causing some weird phenomena. And he's like, no, I was worried that you all were going crazy, right? So, like,
right.
And then there's the other person they interview who was, I think, from the local county something, or I forget what. It looked like it was some sort of government agency, and they're interviewing him, and like, well, what do you think went on here? He's like, well, I don't want to be rude, and like, well, no, tell us, like, well, I have to question what you were trying to accomplish, like, trying to get attention or something. And there's just all these points where they're not getting what they want out of it. And it seems like, they're trying to make it this serious thing. Some of those interviews, though, remind me a little bit of the interviews with experts in the film we did very early, The House in Between, right?
I was waiting to bring that up. Yeah.
But,
And I think that's intentional, because
Yeah.
when you watch any paranormal documentary that tries to come at it from a scientific angle, it's almost invariably not with the help of real scientists. And when they do try to bring on real scientists, like that long-suffering guy in The House in Between, who was trying to explain about basic scientific tenets, it's very frustrating for them, because they're talking to laymen who fancy themselves experts
and are trying to fit what the information they're giving them in a way that doesn't really make sense scientifically. They're taking whatever they are getting and trying to shoehorn it right into in a way that doesn't fit. So I thought those interviews, especially when he talked about, that he was worried about some impaired decision making or cognition, those were some funny notes to me. Real quick, I want to say hey to Derek, who's here hanging out with us again. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Derek.
So I thought those were some funny notes. There were probably a few other notes that I thought were humorous, but that was probably. Oh, well, there was another point really towards the end, right? There's a point where, like, after their fight, right? Then they kind of didn't really make up, but they kind of said, okay, we're not friends, but, we're going to work on this. And there's a point where John's like, hey, can I stay here? My carbon dioxide, whatever, or something is whatever. And Levi's like, no, okay, fine. I guess you can stay here. And John's walking to the bedroom. And so we've just had this scene where they had been in this big fight, said some really shitty things that were a really impressive dialogue of fuck you. And then, like, they kind of, it felt like, well, were they reconciling? Well, not really. And at the end of all of that, John is walking, towards the bedroom, and he's got this smile on his face that almost makes you think, I'm going to say something really mean right now, friend, But no, he's like, just kidding. Can I have a beer? Like, can I have a second beer so I can fall asleep? To me, that upon the second viewing, that was funny, because you see that look on his face and you think, oh, he's about to say something like, hey, man, listen, I'm sorry. Or, you know what, dude, we've been through some shit together. But no, he's just like, can I have a second beer? To me, that was funny.
Yeah, it is funny. And of course, the film is about these two new neighbors who happen to witness this phenomenon and try and document it so they can sell the documentary to Netflix. And I think there was some humor there too, right? Because they're obviously, Benson and Moorhead have been making films for, I think, 10 years now. They're well-versed in that world. And at one point, I think John says, I think Netflix will pay like $10 million this documentary. And that's very unlikely. Or who knows? Maybe it is very likely. Again, not my industry, but it seemed optimistic based on what little I've heard. But so they get together, and one of the things that I thought really worked about this, and it actually in a way ties to another film we've done here, which is The Scary of 61st, which is how obsession kind of creates these unlikely bedfellows, because you've got, and I think we've all been in this situation to one degree or another, where you end up spending more time than you care to, or than perhaps you expected, with someone you don't really know. And everything's good until you start to get to know them. And then you start learning little things about them, and you think, no, I don't want to know you any more than I already do. For example, John is a member of an apocalyptic church and is actually quite judgmental. And I tell you, I live in fear of that, of making friends with someone and thinking, well, this person's all right, I can be around them. And then, they tell you something really heinous about their views on race or sexuality or who knows, right? And I thought it captured that really well, this notion of how well do you know someone and how much you're willing to put up with in pursuit of a common goal. Because I think too, it's as a man, and I think they're in their 30s, it gets harder to make friends as you get older, especially if you don't necessarily have a pursuit. And so you end up, just kind of making do with the best you got. And the best you got is not great. Because I definitely sympathize more with Levi in the film than I did with John. Even though Levi has his own issues with substance and obviously tormented by inner demons, I really saw him as a much more sympathetic character than John. Although interestingly, in the press they've done for the film, they both sort of said that at different points they felt that neither character. Pardon me, I should say that they felt that the characters sort of switch off being the villain.
That's interesting. It's interesting you say that, and I would. That's one way of putting it. I would agree, because one of the first things I kind of put, or one of the notes I had in my first viewing, was that in the first half of the movie, I thought Levi was, I described it not as villain, but as the weirder of the two, the one that was more kind of something's off with this dude.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the second half of the film, I became convinced it was John, right? So they flipped. So I would guess it would seem Levi's the villain or the off-center one in the first half, and then it's John in the second half.
Yeah. And one of the things that they set up is with Levi is that he's a registered sex offender, and John really hangs us over him.
Yeah.
But if his story is to be believed, he's a registered sex offender because during lockdown, he had to take a leak when he was out in public and there was no public bathrooms, and he ends up peeing on what turns out to be a daycare center, a closed daycare center. Yeah. But regardless.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it kind of reminded me of when I was delivering food during the pandemic, because I had the same problem, not the daycare thing, but just there were no bathrooms. There were no public bathrooms. And you're, zipping around bringing people food because not a lot of people were willing to be out on the road at that time, or kind of out in the world. And you came to really value the restaurants who would let you use their bathroom. Like I will take a bullet for Salt Pierogi Bar or for the White Spot up on High Quadra. I will ride or die for those guys simply because they let me use their goddamn bathroom.
Nice. Friends for life.
Telling you, whether they want it or not.
That's interesting. No, that's a good observation. Yeah. And it's interesting, the whole thing about when you start to get to know someone and then you encounter something like, ooh, right. And it's weird because you don't want to be that person who I think it's one of those things why as humans we are guarded, right? We're careful, or if we have good boundaries and we are careful because if you're investing in a relationship, you're opening up part of who you are, you're spending time, you're getting to know a person. And then if you find something that's just I don't want that in my life, you don't want to come across as the asshole who's sorry, but get out of here. And you also, but you also don't want to hang around that. Right. So, but I think we've all been there where we meet someone, they seem cool, we hang out, and then we get to know a little bit more about them. Oh no, there's something about you that I'm not okay with. So that's an interesting thing. Yeah. I
just told a story on the last episode of Ghost Story Guys. I think it was the last episode, but a long time ago, very long time ago now. I worked for the provincial government as a file clerk. And Victoria is a notoriously hard place to make friends. And I don't know, Derek, your experience may differ. I know you live in Victoria as well, but I found it very hard to make friends there. And so I got to be friendly with one of my coworkers from the government, and he would invite me back to his place for beers. And I got to be honest, his apartment was actually not much. It was probably equal in terms of quality to John and Levi's place. And although his was in a crack house, so I hopefully that's not the case, because apparently it was shot in Benson and Moorhead's apartments.
Okay.
So hopefully that's not the case for them. I'd like to think they can avoid living in a crack house, but it's LA, so who knows? Right. But anyways, I would visit this guy, and again, because I had no one else to hang out with, but he was into Alex Jones back before Alex Jones really blew up. So this would be 2007.
Yeah. And
I'd go there and you think, okay, well, I'll put up with this for company. And pretty soon the lizard people come out, and the globalists, and then it's a matter of figuring out how much can I endure before this beer is no longer worth it.
Right. For me, the answer is one beer is not worth it.
That's fair. Yeah, that's fair. Something I wanted to bring up was, of course, I've been making a show about ghosts and strange goings on for coming up on 7 years now. And something that I really took away from 6 years, I guess, but something that really struck me about the film was how, and I tweeted about this because that matters. But anyways, how much the film, I thought, really cleverly lampooned the paranormal community in a lot of ways, because obviously the whole point of the film is that it's this documentary they're making, and because of their incompetence, the old tapes get cooked, so they have to recreate certain parts of it, and then you can no longer trust the authenticity of anything because certain parts have had to be recreated, which raises the question of, okay, well, how do we know what happened in the first place? And obviously Levi and John each have their own theories. John becomes really attached to this idea that there's something happening there because of this Pythagorean cult, which has these connections into Los Angeles' history and so on and so forth. And he becomes really convinced, like, this is the explanation. And so he starts trying to shoehorn the facts, so to speak, into this mold. But really, they're just drawing connections. You and I, again, were joking off air. It's like Dirk Gently's holistic detective agency, but for conspiracy theories. They're just, free associating and drawing these threads. And I see that so often, in the paranormal community. I see people kind of having these little mini adventures. And I mean, great, that's great, have fun. But they sort of, I think, attach greater significance to events and things. Not everyone, but some people. And will sort of create this narrative where they're on a grand adventure, but they're just kind of piecing it together and making it fit. And what that does, again, who gives a shit, have fun. But what that does is it hurts real inquiry. Because, again, I've been doing this for a while. I really do think there is something there, whether it's actually spirits of the dead or any of this shit, right? Aliens, whatever. There's something happening. So the question then is what? And I think all this kind of, I think I refer to it as adolescent myth making. I think it really gets in the way of actual inquiry.
No, I think that's a great point. And when we were talking off air, and I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus, but a prime example of this is the film Hellier, right? Which I watched and I enjoyed. It was fun, but they use this term synchronicity as sort of a guise for drawing these conclusions and connecting things that are very loose connections, but then when you put the web together and create this story, it becomes, kind of interesting and for some people compelling. And that's what happens, right? You take all these little pieces and then you when you're looking through this lens of this narrative, you find ways to connect. And the human brain is so creative. We can find ways to make those connections. Like that's, so we'll do that. And, I share your frustration with that because one of the reasons or one of the perspectives from which I've approached the paranormal, and this, and maybe people who watch know this. Did I mention I have a PhD? Did I mention that?
No, that's never ever
come up. No, but
this is the first time.
Really, the first time. No, but in all seriousness, my day job, I'm a sociology professor, and I teach that, and I do some research, and I've come to have an interest in the paranormal, and I sort of have these perspectives of wanting to try to approach it from a authentic scientific approach. You think legitimate. I know that sounds very condescending. I don't mean it to, but using empirical methods and you're right that like one of the things I'd love to see is for science to take a fresh look at the paranormal and give it a chance as something to study. Right. Guys running around with voltmeters and EMF detectors are not going to prove to anyone that ghosts exist other than the already initiated, right? Yeah. If you don't already believe, that's not going to be a scientist. You can bring all the data you want from that. A scientist isn't going to. A scientist wants to collect their own data using known methods, and they want to measure and test things, but they're not doing that because they don't take the paranormal serious. And what you're talking about, these kinds of things, pseudoscience, undermine that, right? Undercut that. So my perspective is I'd love to start doing some legitimate scientific inquiries into that, not coming at it with trying to shoehorn things in. Let's just take a look at what's there and try to study it in the hopes that maybe there will be enough scientists out there somewhere with the appropriate training to actually start exploring it themselves, right? That's science will have, whether you like it or not, or think it's wrong or not, science isn't going to buy it until science itself is the one that's doing the testing, right? So so that whole thing you're talking about is undermining the potential for that to happen.
Yeah. And so again, I think the film really expertly nails that and that community, and which was interesting because reading press for the film, Benson and Moorhead are not really that way inclined. They're interested in Aleister Crowley, as a historical figure, but in terms of the kind of subjects I think we would talk about on, say, Ghost Story Guys, I think they fall firmly into the camp. Yeah. So maybe that ability to sort of encapsulate that community just comes from seeing it at a remove and being able to go, yeah, you guys are kind of chasing your tails.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I think you're right, though. The way they set up these interviews and the way that the characters seem to take themselves just a little too serious. Well, John, to be quite frank, the way John took himself a little too serious, smoking his cigarette, being interviewed, and and just coming up. I misjudged my calculations or whatever the hell he says.
Oh yeah, and that's like, so often the case with these things, right? These guys will say, "Oh, I figured out X, Y, and Z," and it turns out they have at best a rudimentary understanding of whatever concept it is they're applying. I mean, I've not myself, because I generally try to be conservative about what I say. I'm not a scientist at all. Obviously, I've been known to wear a lab coat, but that's for sex stuff. And hey, well, what's even funnier is I live by myself, so figure that out. But anyways, what was it? I completely lost track of what I was talking about.
Science and taking themselves too seriously, and some folks who.
Oh yeah, right. Thanks. Yeah. So I try to be conservative about the shit I say, but I've had to deal with in past working with someone who is not cautious about slinging these terms around, and then having to get the email and going, all right, yeah, this is not accurate. This is not accurate. This is not a real thing. And there's a lot of that, and again, it's not just limited to, it's a larger problem.
There's a whole kind of issue of maybe people seeking legitimacy and feeling, so they use this vocabulary and try to construct these scientific sounding terms and frameworks in order to try to feel like they have that. And that's never goes well.
There's also, I felt there's a little bit of, I don't know what you'd call it. I'm sure there's a term. I heard it referred to years ago when I was in Morocco as 7 years in Tibet syndrome, where, this was in response to, I met some Canadians in one city or another down there. We got talking, and I mentioned that I'd run into a few other Canadians, and I'm a small town guy. I was excited to see other Canadians in such a far away place, and they were not. They were quite rude. And I mentioned this to this couple, and they said, oh yeah. They said, well, a lot of folks who come to places like this, they want to pretend like they're the first white people to do it. They want to pretend like they're the first one to do this, and they're on this grand adventure. And if they run into someone else from the same, 6 blocks down the road or whatever, it kind of kills their hero boner.
Right. No, that makes sense.
They called it 7 years in Tibet syndrome, and there's a part in the film where they're talking. John and Levi are talking on the roof, and they're talking about. Or sorry, no, this is a conversation that happens in John's apartment, but he says that we live in the most surveilled time in history, but there's never been proof, any kind of photographic proof of a ghost or a UFO, and that's just not true. How real some of them are is open for debate. But I mean, the U.S. government has released footage of UFO encounters for which they currently have no explanation. Right. And again, I think that's almost an intentional thing, because one quality I've noticed in the kind of people we're talking about is they like to pretend like they've discovered things, or they're the first people to do X. So they'll say, oh, no one else has come up with proof. Well, that's not entirely true. I mean, some people have got images. It's just there's so much bullshit out there because this has become entertainment. And I'll be honest, I see that a lot. People who do what I do, in order to stay relevant, to stay kind of in people's minds, they have to be having experiences. They have to be going ghost hunting. They have to be, seeing X, Y, and Z. And so it makes it just by default things get faked.
Yeah, it's interesting because, coming from an academic world, it's just a completely different paradigm and world that like academics live in with information and discovery, right? Because like it sounds like in this world you're describing here, that the primary thing is building legitimacy through discoveries to your audience, through discoveries that are fantastic, right? And making things sound more bigger than they are. And in academic worlds, there's this very pissy, rigorous peer review process, right? Where if you try to overplay what you are discovering and make it sound bigger than it is, you're going to get ripped to shreds by people, who are like, you think too highly of yourself, and you have to really, really kind of humbly kind of state your meager contribution to knowledge, and so it's interesting to look at that way. But think about it, like, and man, I don't want this to sound at all elitist, because I don't mean it to be this way, but Someone
Whatever
who
you
pursues,
say, Dr. Comeau.
right, it's a losing battle. Like someone who spends a career pursuing knowledge and expertise in whatever area, engineering, an academic field, whatever it is you do, right? There's so much that goes into that, years of training and education and hoops to go through and gates to get through, and then building your career, right? And people work hard in whatever field that is to do that. But then there are folks who are weekend warriors, and they want that attention, that notoriety, and they construct, these ideas and these things they think they know, and they'll spend time researching it. But by researching, I mean like reading a few books and on the internet, and it's
Watching a YouTube video.
Hey, and like, I don't know, but they want to feel like that level of expert. But unless you've been through those hoops, you don't understand how much there really is to it. Like,
right.
Like I'm not trying to build this up. Like a PhD is no joke. Like in terms of the work you got to go through to get there. And I think until you've gone through something like that, you don't understand. And it both is a lot of work, but it also humbles you.
Sure.
Because you spend so much time around so many brilliant people, you're like, oh wow, there's so much I don't know, right? And whereas conversely, if you're a person who's trying to build up something in a public space through fantastic sorts of things, there are the haters and there are the people who love you, but there isn't that peer review process that you have to go through. Anyway, I know that's a little off topic, but
just to sort of put a button on that, I mean, in actual fact, it's not uncommon for people to obscure where they got what they got. So it can't be reviewed.
Yeah.
Everyone's kind of got their own little fiefdom. And again, when I say everyone, I don't mean everyone who works in my field. It's just there are certain people. I can think of someone in particular, although I won't say his name, but he's fairly well known in the field, and he's a researcher, but he's a tool, and he just keeps everything really close to the vest because he's got this weird sense of feeling of ownership about it all, and it drives me nuts. I've never had to interact with the guy personally, thank God, but I know people who have, and it just he treats it like he's like, I know something you don't know, and it's not becoming.
Well, let me take us in a different direction.
All right.
One of the things I really enjoyed about this film, this completely different topic here in terms of just as a film and the setting. So I'm originally from Arizona. I'm not from LA, but I've spent a reasonable amount of time there. I've traveled through there. I've stayed there with friends. I've spent time there. I lived in Northern California. I have a little bit of an idea of what LA is like. Not the glitzy Hollywood thing, but real LA, right?
Right.
And I felt like this film, and obviously they lived there, so it's not surprising it would be this way, but I feel like they really captured LA, the real LA in this film, like what the tone of what it's like, certainly the mid-century crappy apartment, right?
Right.
The fire in the hills, right?
Yeah.
But like the coyote, he keeps showing these images of a coyote, but like if you're in LA, one of the things you start to realize is like there are these reminders that there's to the east of you is desert, and those little reminders, and it's a city brimming with people who are trying to make it. A lot of and just the overall feel of architecture and life. Really, I felt like it captured in a way. The only other film for me, and I know there's others that have probably done this, that I felt captured it as well, was actually the film Swingers, Vince Vaughn and Jon Favreau. Because that film's known for all of its quotable lines, but if you really watch it, there's all these little diners, and you've got these guys going to these bars and driving around and trying to figure out life in their crappy little apartments, and the little golf course that they're playing at, and just all this city life that has a look and feel of LA, and being surrounded by the desert, all of that. I really appreciated how this film captured that feeling of what the real Los Angeles is for people who live there and who know that it's not all Hollywood and glitz everywhere.
Yeah. Working class LA is, that's most of LA. And I think folks do forget that. On the coyote thing, that reminds me of a story I heard once when I was hanging out at the Comedy Store, and I got talking to one of the doormen, and he was telling me that the Comedy Store closes. I think they finish in the OR at 2, and then probably by the time everything wraps up, it's considerably later. But this guy was telling me he finished his shift, and he had parked his car in the hills above the Comedy Store. So he was walking up to his car, and all of a sudden he realized he was surrounded by a pack of coyotes.
Oh wow!
And he thought, shit, this guy was not a big guy. And I mean, I don't know how well you could fight off a pack of coyotes anyways. Dudes, we like to overestimate our ability in these things, but I would not bet on me via pack of coyotes. And I think it was only because another car came along that sort of scattered them that he was able to get in his car and then take off. But
interesting.
Yeah, it's again a side of the city that you don't often think about. Even I like going to LA. I like the buzz there. I don't, I think it would eat me alive if I tried to live there. But
yeah,
I just like being around it. But I that's a side of it I very rarely see. Is the coyotes and things. And
yeah. I had a friend who was stationed out at the Edwards Air Force Base, which I think is Rosamond, California, out by Lancaster, which is kind of an exurb. It's out in the desert, but I spent some time around there too. If you've ever seen the film The Salton Sea.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Salton Sea is an area out there, and I believe a lot of it's filmed out there. And when you start getting further east in LA and then even out into those exurbs out there, that encroaching desert really becomes vivid and salient in that experience. Now, when you get close to the coast, it's more the beach, but the further inland you go into LA, and which is where a lot of the working class neighborhoods you're describing are, right? The rich folks live by the beach, and the working class folks live a little further in, closer to the desert. And the further in, I feel like you get more and more of that feel.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. This is about 14 years ago now. I went hiking down in that part of the desert with a friend who sort of knew he grew up in Albuquerque. And so he kind of knew the desert, and we went hiking down through Joshua Tree, Anza Borrego. And I remember we had lunch in Salton City.
Okay.
And it's a completely different world.
Yeah.
I remember looking, you could just, I think we were in Hemet, California, and you could look towards the west and you saw the smog hanging over the valley. But out there, if civilization ended suddenly, it might take you a while to find out.
Right.
And it might not look all that different.
Yeah.
It's kind of fascinating country. But anyways, we've gone further afield from the film. So any other points that you wanted to bring up?
As someone who you see, I've got my guitars. It was interesting to see them playing their musical instruments, right? Levi had the guitar, which I will tell you, I don't know how well this actor, if he really does play guitar, but from the way he was just kind of picking the notes, he didn't look like a guitar player. I wonder if he just learned that. But when John brings in the theremin, that was just great. But like I look at them like, it's like it reminds me of that meme, name this band, right? When you see a picture of a couple guys,
right?
But then, like I looked at it, I was like, man, these guys look like they're like the newest members of the Black Keys. That's what I saw with the theremin and the guitar. So I don't know, it felt like they belong there. So that I enjoyed that little bit, and when they're playing the music with whatever the floating entity is, that was kind of interesting. And then the conclusion, the part of it that really seems to be there, this is the supernatural whatever hook or whatever, is at the end, where John wakes up floating and he looks out and he sees Levi is floating into the sky, and and then whatever happens from that. Now the whole thing is framed in this idea that they filmed this, but then they talk to these filmmakers who were hired to do recreations with them playing themselves. And I think that becomes that sort of bending of what's real and what's not, right?
Yeah.
You wonder, like, I feel like they probably keep that ambiguous intentionally based on kind of the way you've described their intent to sort of satire or at least question this whole genre of supernatural film documentaries.
Yeah.
So you wonder how much of that is supposed to be a recreation, and is Levi flying up into the sun or into the moon, right? Is that supposed to be a recreation, right?
Right.
Overall, I thought it was, like I said, the film craft I thought of this film was pretty good. I really liked that of the film.
Right. Yeah, me too. It was interesting to read an interview with them in, I want to say Filmmaker magazine or something like that, where they talked about the technical challenges. Because it was a COVID production, there was only 3 people on the immediate crew. And so when one of them is talking, the other one is filming them.
Yeah.
And they said, and again, I don't think you would know this to look at the film, but one of the challenges was things like matching eye lines. You know, they really had to work at maintaining that. And, you know, it's more complex than I think you would give it credit for just watching it. But knowing all that, again, I think it works really well for what it sets out to do. It's a 2-hour film that doesn't feel like it. There's a similar film, quasi-similar theme, Under the Silver Lake.
Okay.
And, you know, it deals with conspiracy in Los Angeles, but it's a much grander film, a much more expensive film, I believe. And it's also 35 minutes longer.
Okay.
And I really appreciated this one's comparative brevity.
Yeah, the first time I watched it, it felt a little long. The second time, it didn't, and I think that comes back to how the first time I watched it with the wrong expectations,
Right?
And that's probably part of why that happened. But the second time, yes, I felt that way. It felt like it wasn't too long. So yeah.
I think that's the end of my notes too. I think I've sort of nailed all the. Actually, one last thing. I really, really appreciated the humanity in both the characters, and particularly in Levi. And I think I identified with Levi more because, I mean, when you talk about the actor's inexperience with playing the guitar, I would almost venture to say that is an intentional thing, because Levi, you know, he never sticks with anything long enough to really learn it. And the scene where John is watching the security playback, and he sees Levi just kind of dancing around his apartment, goofing around. And, you know, it's because very likely, and I can't remember if he actually says this, but, you know, he has ADHD. And as someone who also has ADHD, I mean, I don't have it that bad. I can't focus, you know, but I know people who really struggle with that.
Yeah.
And it just to kind of watch and realize this is this guy's life. You know, this is what he does. You know, this is how he spends his days. He goes to community service, he goes to work, and he comes home and he doesn't really have many friends, and he just kind of fills his day and can't really seem to build towards anything. And he's aware of it, and it drives him nuts. And I just thought that was really kind of striking. And I felt for the guy, especially when John is quite cutting to him towards the end. You know, I've met guys like John before. In fact, one of my oldest friends, we're not close anymore, but he was like John, where he thinks that to say the cruelest thing about someone is to show that you know them. And he never understood that to say these things about someone, generally speaking, they're things they know about themselves already. So you're not delivering them any kind of wild truth. Yeah. You're just being mean.
Right.
And at the end there, I really felt for Levi, because I've seen that, you know, and sometimes I've been that guy. And I've been on the receiving end of those, whatever you want to call them, those tirades. And they're not telling you anything you don't already know. They're just reminding you, and it never feels good. So I particularly appreciated that.
No, that's a great point. Like a similar thought about Levi kind of crossed my mind a few times as I watched it, because he just, you know, listened to him talk about, you know, all the things he had tried and that then couldn't stick with, you know, wanting to be a skydive instructor. He'd been on one jump, wanting to start a band, wanting to get into skateboarding apparel, wanting to do all these things, but had passport issues. And like, it's a different life than I've experienced, but I sympathize with like my experience is coming from not having much, making some mistakes early, but getting my shit together. You know, I dropped out of high school, but got my GD, but then eventually went on to college and kind of found my path and was very determined, but avoided making the kinds of mistakes that would completely derail me, like having records and things like that. And then I see this guy who seems like not a bad dude, who just can't ever get off the ground, and everything he can't stick with. And then there's just, you know, between income issues and legal issues and passport issues and suspended driver's license and parole, just seems like a nice guy who's made some mistakes that just keep holding him back and down. And just imagining what that life is like. I'm fortunate to have in a life where I can aspire and pursue things and make progress towards those things if I work at it. And then imagining what it'd be like if, because of all those circumstances, I was in a situation where I couldn't make progress. I no matter how hard I tried, just my, wheels were spinning in place, and I felt for that. Right. And then, then John, though, I didn't sympathize with him. I mean, because he was kind of a jerk, and I think you're right. The people in my life, whatever flaws they might have, my job's not to point those out. My job is to kind of do what I can to be a friend and help them however I can through that stuff. And so, yeah, John was kind of an ass.
John was kind of an ass. If there's any takeaway from this, folks, it's that John was kind of an ass.
Yes.
So, Joseph, would this be a recommendation from you?
For someone who likes independent films, yes, it would be.
All right. Yep. I would say the same. You can rent it on all the major platforms. I bought a copy on Google Play. As always, please don't pirate independent films.
Yes.
I mean, if you want to do it with Avengers Endgame, well, okay, fine. It made a $1 billion. It's not going to hurt. But independent movies, you got to vote with your dollars. If you don't pay for them, then they won't make them. So again, you can get that on streaming platform. Well, you can rent it on platforms everywhere. I'm sure it'll turn up on Netflix at some point, but it's $4 or $5. It's worth a rental. Check it out. And just before we head out, a little something I want to share in a new segment that we call The Boost. All right, so The Boost is just an opportunity for me or Joseph, whoever has something to add, to sort of pop a film or a couple films that we're not going to have time to do on the show, but are still worth your time. And this time around, I wanted to point out two films that I've seen recently, which in a way, I kind of dovetails with our theme of DIY, which is what Benson and Moorhead have done on Something in the Dirt. Those films are In a Stranger's House and Landlocked. Now, neither of them are as good as this film, but both have a lot going for them. I believe In a Stranger's House has exactly one cast member who also happens to be the writer, director, and everything else. And Landlocked is made by a family. I believe it's directed by one of the brothers, stars their father and a couple of the other brothers. And it's a little more obtuse, but it's still again, worth your time. $4 or $5. In a Stranger's House is streaming on Tubi, which if you don't know Tubi, Tubi, you should, because it's a great place to see a lot of stuff that's actually not anywhere else. Especially in Canada. Weirdly, a lot of stuff that you can find on Tubi in Canada is not streaming anywhere else. Another film that I don't have the graphic for it, but DC Hamilton's The Fair, which is a really exceptional sci-fi film. That was never released in Canada. It only ever popped up on Tubi about a year ago. So, yeah, check it out. Again, In a Stranger's House should be on Tubi. Landlocked you can rent, and again, that's on rental platforms everywhere. Joseph, any last things to add before we head out?
Not really. This was an interesting film. I enjoyed it, especially the second watch through. And it's always good to hang out with you, Bren.
Likewise, my friend. Always. I guess until next time, but I think we'll be talking about Skinamarink because
probably
why not?
Yeah.
You can find me on Twitter, Instagram as Largely the Truth, and you can find the Ghost Story Guys, Book of the Dead, Transmissions from the Void, all the shows that Joseph mentioned, anywhere you get your podcasts.
You can find me at Comeau13 on Twitter. If you're into football, I've got a Cardinals channel called The Cardinal Rule, which now is also available. Some of my stuff on podcasts too. So you can find me there. And then I've got a couple other YouTube channels, In Search of Ghosts, The Sociology Professor, whatever else I end up spending some time doing. Perfect. All right, folks. Well, until next time, we're weird. And you're weird. So why not be weird together? See you next time.